Case 01 Lydell Grant, December 10th, 2010, 11:40 at night. Outside the Blur Bar at 710 Pacific Street in Houston, Texas, Aaron Shearhorn ran toward the entrance, screaming for help. The bouncers turned him away, reading the situation wrong. Seconds later, he was cornered in the adjacent parking lot and stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen with a folding pocket knife. His attacker fled into the dark residential side streets and eventually left Houston for Georgia altogether. Within 6 minutes, Houston Police Department officers were on the scene. What they found beside Aaron Shearhorn's body, biological material preserved under his fingernails, would eventually free a man who had nothing to do with his death. That would take 9 years. Lydell Grant was 33 years old in December 2010. Born in Houston in 1977, he had spent his working years in sporadic manual labor, car washes, commercial warehouses, the kinds of jobs that do not leave much of a paper trail. He carried a prior record, a DWI conviction, a controlled substance possession charge. Neither was violent. He had never been arrested for an assault or a weapons offense. He could not afford a private attorney and was assigned a public defender. His mother, Donna Avery, would become his primary alibi witness. On the night Aaron Shearhorn died, Grant was not at the Blur Bar. The Houston Police Department would spend less than a week deciding otherwise. Aaron Shearhorn was 28 years old. He worked in Houston's hospitality industry and was active in the Montrose's neighborhood's LGBTQ+ community, where he had built a wide and devoted circle of friends. He attended Houston area colleges and was in the process of transitioning into full-time business management. He performed in local theater. He had a future mapped out. The night he was chased down Pacific Street was not supposed to be the end of it. His parents survived him. His community held vigils. Regional LGBTQ+ advocacy networks raised funds in his name. The investigation began correctly enough. 6 independent witnesses, bar patrons, and employees provided physical descriptions of the man they had seen chasing Shearhorn, and those descriptions were used to generate a composite sketch. The sketch, however, did not match Lydell Grant. His facial structure, head shape, and weight distribution contradicted the composite in ways that were visible and specific. An anonymous tipster, having seen the sketch circulated on local news, made a vague geographic association and called Crime Stoppers. The tipster mentioned Grant's name. HPD placed Grant's photograph into a photo lineup that was anything but neutral. All 6 witnesses selected him. Each one had already processed the inaccurate composite sketch. Each one's memory had been contaminated by the same flawed image. None of them had seen Lydell Grant on Pacific Street on December 10th, 2010. Grant was arrested during a targeted traffic stop in Houston that same December, charged with first-degree murder under Texas Penal Code, Section 1902. Bond was set at $100,000. He could not post it and remained detained through trial. Defense motions to suppress the eyewitness identifications on grounds of the lineup's suggestive structure were denied by the trial judge. Spring 2012. Harris County Criminal Courthouse, Houston. Judge Moises Laux presiding. The trial lasted approximately 5 business days. The state's case was, at its core, 6 adults pointing at Lydell Grant in open court. The prosecution offered no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, to Aaron Shearhorn, or to the folding knife used to kill him. The defense presented Donna Avery's account of where her son was that night and pointed to the absence of any forensic connection. Grant did not testify, on advice of counsel. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on 1 count of first-degree murder. Judge Laux imposed life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. Standing before the court, Grant stated for the record that the justice system was making a catastrophic error. The prosecutor, speaking to local media afterward, described 6 eyewitnesses as an airtight case. Direct appeals to the Texas Court of Appeals were rejected. The years passed. In 2019, the Innocence Project of Texas secured the right to run the biological material from Aaron Shearhorn's fingernail scrapings through True Allele, an advanced probabilistic genotyping software capable of resolving complex DNA mixtures with a precision that 2010 forensic methods could not achieve. The software did two things. It completely excluded Lydell Grant from the DNA profile, and it returned a direct hit on the FBI's CODIS database. The name was Jermerico Carter, a known felony offender who had fled Houston for Atlanta, Georgia, in the days following the murder. Law enforcement located Carter. Under interrogation, he provided a full and detailed confession, describing how he alone had chased Aaron Shearhorn down Pacific Street and stabbed him in the parking lot outside the Blur Bar. In May 2021, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals declared Lydell Grant actually innocent and vacated the conviction. He had served 9 years. Grant is 49 years old today. He lives in Texas and works as a criminal justice reform advocate. His case triggered mandatory reforms to photo lineup protocols in Texas municipal police departments, specifically the adoption of blind and sequential procedures designed to prevent the memory contamination that sent him to prison. The Harris County District Attorney's Conviction Integrity Unit expanded its capacity to fast-track DNA requests in eyewitness-only cases. 6 completely unrelated adults swore under oath that they had seen Aaron Shearhorn's killer. None of them had. Their memories had been overwritten by a composite sketch that did not depict Lydell Grant, channeled through a suggestive lineup that offered them no corrective. A probabilistic genotyping algorithm 9 years later looked past all of it. Jermerico Carter's profile was already in the federal database, waiting. Case 02, Barry Gibbs. The detective assigned to investigate the murder of Virginia Robertson was, at the time of the investigation, an active hitman working for the Lucchese crime family. His name was Louis Ippolito. He carried a New York Police Department shield. He had a salary, a case file, and the authority to put a man's photograph in front of a traumatized witness and tell that witness who to choose. In November 1986 in Brooklyn, New York, he used all of it to destroy the life of a United States Postal Service mail carrier named Barry Gibbs. Gibbs was 39 years old at the time. Born in 1948 in Brooklyn, he had spent his adult life as a federal postal employee, a local mail carrier on a steady route, reliable and unremarkable in the best possible sense. He had a minor record of nonviolent local infractions, nothing approaching assault or homicide. He was thin, fair-skinned, blonde, and significantly balding. He kept to himself. In a borough of millions, he was precisely the kind of man who could be made to disappear into a courtroom without the city noticing. He had no motive, no history of violence, and no connection to the crime Ippolito needed closed. Virginia Robertson was an adult woman, believed to have been in her 30s, who worked as a sex worker in the outer boroughs of New York City. She lived at the margins, displaced from family networks, managing a substance dependency, working night hours on public avenues in a city that offered her almost no institutional protection. There is no documented memorial to her. What is documented is this: she was murdered by a client with connections to organized crime, and the detective assigned to find her killer decided instead to find a substitute and close the file. The murder itself unfolded in the late night hours of November 1986. Robertson was picked up by a client, killed inside a vehicle by manual strangulation, and her body was driven to the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn, where the killer pulled onto the highway shoulder and rolled her remains down an embankment into the brush below. A civilian named Peter Mitchell, passing along the Belt Parkway, witnessed a man standing at the open trunk of a car and saw him drop something heavy over the edge. Robertson's body was discovered within 24 hours. A 1986 autopsy confirmed she had been manually strangled. There was no DNA technology available. Mitchell provided a physical description of what he had seen, and from that description, a composite sketch was generated. The sketch showed a dark-haired, heavy-set man. Detective Louis Ippolito looked at the sketch. Then he looked at Barry Gibbs, thin, blonde, balding, bearing no resemblance to the composite in any measurable way, and decided Gibbs would do. Ippolito had a prior minor interaction with Gibbs, nothing that rose to the level of evidence. That was enough. He forced Gibbs's photograph into a rigged lineup stack and brought Peter Mitchell in for an identification. What Mitchell later told federal agents was that Ippolito had subjected him to extreme physical and psychological coercion, explicitly instructing him to disregard the obvious physical discrepancies between Gibbs and the composite sketch. Mitchell told Ippolito repeatedly that Barry Gibbs looked nothing like the man he had seen at the trunk. Ippolito told him to sign the identification anyway and threatened to murder Mitchell and his family if he refused. Mitchell, terrified, signed. Barry Gibbs was arrested in Brooklyn in late 1986 and charged with second-degree murder under New York Penal Law Section 12525. He was held without bail. In 1988, before a jury in Kings County Supreme Court, Ippolito took the stand as a highly decorated detective and described an investigation that had never happened. Peter Mitchell identified Gibbs from the witness box. His testimony built entirely on terror and Ippolito's threats. The defense pointed to the complete lack of physical evidence, to Gibbs's balding blonde appearance versus the dark-haired, heavy-set composite, and to the total absence of motive connecting him to Virginia Robertson. The jury returned a guilty verdict. Gibbs screamed from the defense table that he had been framed. Ippolito remained expressionless. The sentence was 20 years to life. Gibbs served the majority of those years at Attica Correctional Facility, 19 years in total across multiple maximum security New York State institutions. Standard state-level appeals were denied throughout the 1990s. Then, in 2005, the Federal Bureau of Investigation concluded a years-long investigation and indicted Louis Ippolito and his NYPD partner Stephen Caracappa for their documented work as paid hitmen and enforcement agents for the Lucchese organized crime family. Federal agents reviewing Ippolito's old case files tracked down Peter Mitchell, who had fled to another state years earlier to escape Ippolito's reach. Mitchell broke down before federal investigators and told them everything: the threats against his family, the coercion, his repeated insistence that Gibbs looked nothing like the man he had seen on the Belt Parkway highway shoulder, and Ippolito's response to each of those objections. Barry Gibbs's conviction was vacated in 2005. He had served 19 years for a murder committed by a man whose identity the investigation had never seriously pursued. The city of New York settled a civil lawsuit with Gibbs for $9.9 million. He died on March 23, 2018, in Brooklyn at the age of 70. He spent his final years as a free man in the city, where he had been a mail carrier and then a prisoner. Peter Mitchell knew from the first day in that lineup room that Barry Gibbs was the wrong person. He said so to the detective's face more than once, clearly and directly. The detective was employed by a crime family and had an interest in ensuring those objections went nowhere. Gibbs served 19 years because that arrangement held until a federal indictment finally broke it open. Case 03, Anthony Ray Hinton, July 31st, 1985, Jefferson County, Alabama. Anthony Ray Hinton, 29 years old, was in the driveway of his mother's home changing a tire when detectives arrived with a murder charge, a rusted revolver they had found in the house, and a theory that required them to ignore his alibi, disregard a composite sketch, and put a man with a full beard in the place of a clean-shaven killer. They had no physical evidence placing Hinton at any of the 3 crime scenes. They had no witnesses to the murders. What they had was a revolver that 3 of the world's foremost ballistics experts would later prove was physically incapable of firing the bullets recovered from the victims. The state of Alabama put Anthony Ray Hinton on death row anyway and kept him there for 30 years. Hinton was born on June 1, 1956, in Beverly, Alabama, and raised in rural poverty by his mother, Buller Hinton, a single parent in a deeply religious household that was long on faith and short on money. He graduated from high school and found work as a manual laborer at Bruno's Food Warehouse in Birmingham, where he was employed at the time of his arrest. His criminal record consisted of a single minor juvenile conviction for auto theft. He had never been charged with anything violent. On the nights when 2 fast food managers were murdered in 1985, Hinton was locked inside a secure, monitored warehouse 15 miles from the crime scenes. That alibi was airtight, documented, and ultimately irrelevant to the state's decision to prosecute him. His court-appointed defense attorney was a man named Sheldon Perhax, paid $1,000 to handle a capital murder case. He openly admitted he did not know how to litigate. John Davidson was 52 years old and managed a Mrs. Winner's chicken and biscuits restaurant in Birmingham. Thomas Wayne Vason was 36 years old and managed a Captain D's in the same metro area. Both men were married with adult children and deep roots in Jefferson County. Both were working late-night closing shifts on nights when a lone gunman entered their restaurants, forced them into the back coolers at gunpoint, took the cash receipts, and shot them in the head. Davidson was killed on February 25, 1985. Vason was killed on July 2, 1985. A third robbery at a Quincy's family steakhouse on July 25, 1985, left manager Reginald Smotherman wounded but alive. Smotherman survived. His eyewitness account became the foundation of the state's case against Anthony Ray Hinton. Smotherman worked with investigators to produce a composite sketch of the shooter. The sketch showed a clean-shaven black man. Anthony Ray Hinton had worn a full beard and a heavy mustache for years before the murders occurred and had not shaved them off. This was not a subtle discrepancy. It was visible, permanent, and documented. Jefferson County detectives traced an address associated with Hinton's mother's vehicle, arrived at the property, found an old revolver in the home, and made the decision to ignore the beard entirely. They put Hinton's photograph in a single photo array. The traumatized Smotherman, under pressure, identified him. On July 31, 1985, Hinton was arrested while changing a tire and charged with 2 counts of capital murder under Alabama Code Section 13A 540. The death penalty was actively sought by prosecutor Bob McGregor, a man with a documented history of racially biased jury selection. The trial opened in September 1986 before Judge James Garrett in Jefferson County Courthouse. It lasted less than a week. The prosecution had secured an all-white jury after striking every black prospective juror. Their case rested on 2 claims: that the recovered bullets matched the revolver found in Hinton's mother's home, and that Reginald Smotherman's identification was reliable. To rebut the state's ballistics testimony, Perhax hired a visually impaired civil engineer with no ballistics training who was dismantled on the stand by the prosecution's expert witnesses. Hinton testified in his own defense, stating clearly and passionately that he had never touched the weapon and had never harmed a human being. The jury deliberated briefly. The verdict was guilty on all capital counts. In late 1986, Judge Garrett sentenced Anthony Ray Hinton to death by electrocution. He was transferred to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, where he spent the next 30 years in solitary confinement on death row. During those decades, he listened to the executions of 54 men in the chamber, located just feet from his cell. He also started an inmate book club that, over time, drew prisoners of different races and backgrounds into a shared weekly ritual. An irony the state of Alabama never appeared to register. In 1999, attorney Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative took over Hinton's legal defense. EJI retained 3 of the world's most respected independent ballistics experts, including the former chief ballistics expert for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. All 3 examined the recovered revolver and the crime scene bullets and reached the same conclusion. The bullets could not have been fired from Hinton's mother's gun. The weapon was physically incapable of producing the tool marks on the recovered rounds. The state of Alabama fought this evidence for another 15 years. In 2014, the United States Supreme Court issued a unanimous per curiam decision in Hinton v. Alabama, ruling that Hinton had received constitutionally deficient legal representation, specifically that Perhax's failure to seek adequate funding for a qualified ballistics expert constituted ineffective assistance of counsel. On April 3, 2015, all charges against Anthony Ray Hinton were formally dismissed. He walked off death row, a free man, 30 years after his arrest. Hinton is 68 years old today. He is an international speaker and the author of the memoir, The Sun Does Shine. The case established a landmark precedent governing a capital defendant's right to competent state-funded expert witnesses. The state of Alabama spent 30 years refusing to re-examine a gun that, according to three of the world's leading authorities, never fired the murder bullets. Hinton sat in a 5 by 7 foot cell, attended 54 executions, and read books with strangers while the evidence of his innocence sat in a forensic report the court refused to consider. That is the record. Case Oral 4. Paul Browning. On November 8, 1985, someone walked into Elson's jewelry store in Las Vegas, Nevada, pulled a knife on 60-year-old jeweler Hugo Elson, stabbed him repeatedly during a violent struggle, stole a tray of rings, and fled into a neighboring motel complex. Inside that motel, the killer changed out of bloody clothing, transferred the stolen jewelry to associates, and made himself available to law enforcement as a cooperative witness. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department detectives found the blood-stained jacket in his room. They found the stolen jewelry. They listened to him direct their attention toward Paul Browning. Then they arrested Paul Browning and let the informant walk. Paul Browning was 38 years old in November 1985. Born in Nevada in 1947, he had spent his life in the economic margins of Las Vegas. Local manual labor, hospitality maintenance work, a record of minor property and drug infractions that made him, in the estimation of the detectives who eventually targeted him, an uncomplicated defendant unlikely to command institutional sympathy. He was living in extreme poverty at the time of his arrest and had no resources for private legal representation. He did not match the composite sketch generated from the crime scene witness accounts. None of that constituted an obstacle for the Clark County District Attorney's Office, which pursued his execution with documented intensity. Hugo Elson was 60 years old and had built an independent jewelry business in Las Vegas that served both local residents and the city's constant stream of tourists. He was a known figure in the local merchant community, respected, married, embedded in the commercial life of the city. He was working alone that November afternoon when his attacker entered the store under the pretense of browsing. The struggle was violent and prolonged. The autopsy report documented extensive defensive wounds on Elson's body, confirming he had fought for his life before he died. Neighboring shop owners heard shattering glass and screaming and placed emergency calls. When investigators arrived, they found blood spatters across the glass display cases, footprints, and evidence of the killer's immediate flight into the adjacent motel complex. A witness inside that motel had observed a man running into a room with blood on his hands. That witness provided a physical description that formed the basis of an official composite sketch. The sketch depicted a suspect with a wide, loose afro and a light tan complexion. Paul Browning had tightly braided, dark-complected hair. He did not match the height profile given by the scene witnesses. He did not match the clothing description. He did not resemble the composite. The motel informant who possessed the stolen jewelry and whose room contained the blood-stained jacket pointed at Browning to redirect the investigation away from himself. Detectives from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department accepted that redirection without apparent scrutiny. They shaped the available eyewitness testimony to fit Browning, managed the significant discrepancies between Browning and the composite sketch, and arranged for blood typing tests on the discarded clothing to be handled in ways that served the prosecution rather than the truth. Browning was arrested in November 1985 and charged with first-degree murder with a deadly weapon and armed robbery. The Clark County District Attorney's Office pursued the death penalty aggressively, as was its established practice. The trial opened in 1986 in Clark County District Court and lasted approximately 2 weeks. The prosecution's case rested on jailhouse informant testimony, statements from the motel tenant, and the eyewitness identifications that detectives had carefully cultivated over the course of the investigation. The bloody jacket found in the informant's motel room was presented to the jury with the visual suggestion that it belonged to Browning, though no legitimate forensic evidence supported that attribution. The defense argued that every piece of physical description from the crime scene, the composite sketch, the clothing, the height, the complexion, excluded Browning. The jury convicted on all counts, including capital murder. Paul Browning was sentenced to death by lethal injection and transferred to the death row unit at Ely State Prison in Nevada. He remained there for 33 years. Federal habeas corpus proceedings eventually forced open the Clark County District Attorney's files, and what investigators found inside those files constituted one of the most thoroughly documented Brady violations in Nevada legal history. The DA's office had concealed the benefits provided to its jailhouse informants. They had buried blood test results that excluded Browning from the biological evidence collected at the scene. They had suppressed the original police logs documenting that the earliest eyewitnesses had described a man whose appearance matched the composite and bore no physical resemblance to Paul Browning. All of it had been locked away for 3 decades to protect a conviction built on an informant whose own room contained the murder evidence. In 2017, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ruled that the volume of suppressed exculpatory evidence and the scope of the prosecutorial misconduct were sufficient to invalidate the conviction entirely. In 2019, Paul Browning's conviction was formally vacated and all charges against him were officially dismissed. He was released from Nevada's death row after 33 years. Browning is 79 years old. He lives quietly in Nevada, managing significant medical needs accumulated across 3 decades on death row at Ely State Prison. The physical evidence from Hugo Elson's murder, the jacket, the recovered jewelry, the blood consistent with the killer's flight path, was found in the possession of the state's cooperating witness. The prosecutors knew this. They buried the laboratory results, suppressed the police logs, and filed for the execution of a man who did not match the composite sketch, while the actual evidence aged inside the informant's room and eventually inside their own files. Case 05, Chester Hallman, 3rd, August 20th, 1991, approximately 1 year in the morning, Rittenhouse Square, Center City, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 2 black males and 2 black females pulled alongside Tae Jung Ho and his companion, both University of Pennsylvania students walking home from a late study session. A struggle broke out over a bag. Tae Jung Ho, 24 years old, was shot once in the chest at close range. The 4 perpetrators drove away in a white sports utility vehicle. Within minutes, Philadelphia police stopped Chester Hallman III a few blocks from the scene. He was driving a white Chevy Blazer. He was 21 years old. He was an armored car driver with a completely clean record and an active employment clearance that required him to have one. He would not walk free for 28 years. Chester Hallman III grew up in Philadelphia and entered adulthood with the kind of record that is supposed to keep a young man out of a courtroom. He worked full-time as an armored car driver and security courier, a position that required background clearance and an unblemished criminal history to obtain and maintain. He had no prior arrests, no detentions, no traffic violations. His father, Chester Hallman Jr., was the first person to tell investigators they had the wrong man and spent the next 28 years making that case through every legal avenue available to him. The composite sketch generated from the taxi driver's description of the shooter depicted an older, heavy-set, stocky black male with a broad facial layout. Chester Hallman III was young, slim, and athletic, with facial features that contradicted the sketch in ways that anyone comparing the 2 documents could have identified. Tae Jung Ho had come to Philadelphia from South Korea to study at the University of Pennsylvania, where he had built a strong academic record and established himself as a respected member of the student community. He was the son of a prominent South Korean family. His death reverberated on 2 continents, across the UPenn campus, across the Korean American community in Philadelphia, and across his family in South Korea, where scholarship foundations were established in his name. He had been walking home from studying. He was 24 years old. The taxi driver who had been traveling behind the white SUV as it fled Rittenhouse Square gave investigators a detailed account of the shooter's appearance, which was used to construct the composite sketch. That sketch described someone who was not Chester Hallman III. Philadelphia police stopped him anyway because his white Chevy Blazer was a vehicle that shared only its color and general category with the getaway car. The Blazer was one of the most commonly sold vehicles in the United States at that time. Officers detained Hallman and his female passenger. His passenger was taken to a separate interrogation room and held there for 17 hours. By the time she signed a statement naming Hallman as the shooter, she had been told exactly what to write and explicitly threatened with perjury and murder charges if she deviated from that account on the stand. A jailhouse informant was separately secured to corroborate the state's narrative. Chester Hallman III was charged that same day, August 20th, 1991, with second-degree murder, aggravated assault, conspiracy, and armed robbery. The trial opened in 1993 in the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas and lasted approximately 2 weeks. The prosecution built its case on the female passenger's signed statement and the jailhouse informant's testimony. The defense presented Hallman's employment record, his completely clean background, the absence of any physical evidence connecting him to the shooting, and the fundamental visual contradiction between Hallman and the heavy-set Composite sketch. When the female passenger took the stand, she attempted to tell the truth. Prosecutors had warned her that recanting would expose her to criminal charges. She testified to the statement she had signed after 17 hours in that room. The jury returned a guilty verdict on second-degree murder and the related counts. In 1993, Chester Hallman III was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 23 years old. He had been employed, had a clean record, and had done nothing to Tae Jong-ho. He served time at various maximum security Pennsylvania state correctional institutions over the following 28 years, while dozens of post-conviction relief petitions were filed on his behalf and systematically denied throughout the 1990s and 2000s. In 2018, the Conviction Integrity Unit of the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, operating under newly elected DA Larry Krasner, opened Hallman's master police archive and found what had been buried in it since 1991. The original homicide detectives had documented the identities, physical descriptions, and license plate numbers of the actual perpetrators, a local group who had been operating out of a different white vehicle entirely, within days of Tae Jung-ho's murder. Those files had never been shared with the defense. Both star witnesses formally recanted, providing detailed accounts of the threats and psychological pressure that had extracted their statements. In July 2019, Hallman's conviction was vacated. He walked out of a Pennsylvania correctional facility after 28 years. The city of Philadelphia subsequently settled a civil lawsuit for $9.8 million. His case was featured in the Innocence Files, a documentary series on Netflix. Chester Hallman III is 56 years old. He returned to Pennsylvania after his release and works closely with innocence advocacy organizations. The homicide detectives who prosecuted him possessed the identities, descriptions, and license plates of the actual perpetrators within days of Tae Jung-ho's death. They filed those documents and said nothing. A young man who spent his professional life guarding other people's valuables spent 28 years in maximum security while the real shooters were never charged. Case 06. William Dillon. A sweat-stained yellow T-shirt was found near the body of James Dvorak at Canova Beach, Brevard County, Florida, in August 1981. The shirt belonged to the man who had beaten Dvorak to death in a wooded area adjacent to the public beach. It carried that man's sweat and his biological record of having been there. For 27 years, it sat in a Brevard County evidence locker, while William Dillon served a life sentence in a Florida maximum security prison. In 2007, the Florida Innocence Project secured the right to test it. The DNA profile that came back from the laboratory excluded Dillon entirely. He had never worn that shirt. He had never been in those woods. A fraudulent dog handler and a coerced jailhouse informant had put him there instead. William Dillon was 21 years old in August 1981. He had grown up in Brevard County, coastal, working class, spending his time in the local construction trades and along the beach strip that defined daily life in that part of Florida. His criminal record was limited to minor non-violent property offenses. He had no history of physical aggression toward anyone. Local sheriff's deputies knew him as a neighborhood presence and regarded him as the kind of young man who could be plausibly named without generating significant institutional resistance. during the investigation into Dvorak's murder, they would use that familiarity as a substitute for actual evidence connecting him to the crime. James Dvorak was 39 years old and a recognized figure in the local Brevard County community. On the evening of his death, he was relaxing near the wooded perimeter of the beach area at Canova Beach when an unknown assailant approached him, launched a ferocious physical attack, and bludgeoned him to death with a blunt object. Dvorak was left in the brush. A 1981 autopsy documented massive blunt force trauma to the cranium. His killer stripped off a sweat-soaked yellow t-shirt and left it behind near the body, then disappeared into the surrounding beach crowd. A civilian passing near the wooded area reported seeing a man running from the trees. That witness account produced a composite sketch depicting a suspect with distinct facial features and a specific hair length that did not correspond to William Dillon's physical appearance. There was no blood found on Dillon. There was no physical connection between him and the crime scene. There was no credible evidence placing him in those woods on the evening James Dvorak was killed. Brevard County Sheriff's deputies, under pressure to close a high-profile murder case, reached for two instruments that required no physical evidence at all: a fraudulent forensic expert and a jailhouse informant willing to provide what detectives needed. The expert was John Preston, who presented himself as a certified scent-tracking dog handler capable of following a human scent trail weeks after the original event. Preston claimed that his animal had tracked the olfactory trace from the yellow t-shirt through the passage of time, through all weather conditions, through every environmental factor that would have degraded such a trace to nothing, directly to William Dillon. The underlying methodology had no scientific basis whatsoever. It was a theatrical performance dressed as forensic procedure, and Preston had refined it through repeated deployment across multiple jurisdictions. Alongside Preston's testimony, detectives produced a jailhouse informant who claimed that Dillon had confessed to the murder. There was no physical corroboration for either account. The discrepancy between Dillon and the composite sketch was set aside. The trial opened in late 1981 in Brevard County Courthouse in Titusville, Florida, and lasted under 2 weeks. The prosecution presented Preston as an authoritative forensic expert and leaned on the jailhouse informant's supposed confession account. The defense argued that Dillon had no physical connection to the crime, no blood on his person or clothing, and that Preston's testimony was theatrical fraud rather than science. The jury convicted on first-degree murder under Florida statutes, Section 782-04. Dillon was sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory minimum before any parole consideration. He was 21 years old. Appellate filings were denied throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Florida's courts declined to revisit the conviction on any ground. Then, in 2007, the Florida Innocence Project obtained the yellow t-shirt from the evidence locker and submitted it for modern DNA analysis. The result was unambiguous: a clean, high-quality genetic profile that completely excluded William Dillon. He had never touched the garment. Concurrently, independent investigations into John Preston's career revealed that he was a charlatan who had fabricated expert testimony in coordination with law enforcement agencies across multiple states, selecting pre-identified suspects and constructing a fictional forensic narrative to secure their convictions. Multiple cases across Florida and beyond had been contaminated by his testimony. William Dillon's was among the most prominent. In 2008, Dillon's conviction was vacated, and he was declared actually innocent after 27 years. His case contributed directly to the judicial prohibition on uncorroborated scent dog tracking testimony as primary evidence in Florida criminal trials. William Dillon is 66 years old. He remained in Florida after his exoneration, where he performs as a musician and songwriter and speaks publicly about junk science and its consequences for defendants who cannot afford to challenge it. The yellow t-shirt carrying the true killer's DNA sat in a Brevard County evidence locker for 27 years while Dillon served a life sentence. A dog handler who had fabricated his credentials and his methodology told a jury the shirt led to Dillon. The jury believed him. The state of Florida never looked past that testimony until an innocence organization finally forced it to. Case 07, George Allen. The recording starts. Detectives ask George Allen about the weapon. Allen, severely schizophrenic and unmedicated in a St. Louis interrogation room in February 1982, gives the wrong answer. The recording stops. When it resumes, Allen says the right thing. The recorder goes off again. He says the wrong room. It comes back on. He says the right one. This process repeated itself through a session that produced what the prosecution would present to a jury in 1983 as a confession. In the intervening years, a state forensic technician had conducted blood typing tests on semen collected from the crime scene. Those results proved the biological donor had a blood type that excluded George Allen entirely. That report was placed in a file and locked away for 30 years. George Allen was 26 years old in February 1982. He had grown up in St. Louis, raised by his mother, Lily Allen, a woman who would spend the next 3 decades trying to bring him home. Allen had passed through a special education curriculum and had not completed a standard high school program. He was unemployed, not from indifference but from necessity, because the severity of his chronic schizophrenia made sustained independent employment impossible. He had been formally diagnosed. He required continuous antipsychotic medication. He had a documented history of psychiatric hold evaluations. The neighbors who knew him described a confused, harmless man who wandered the block but threatened no one. He had no criminal history involving violence or sexual assault of any kind. Mary Bell was 31 years old and worked as a professional court reporter within the St. Louis judicial system, the very institutional world that would later fail George Allen so thoroughly. She was deeply connected to her professional community at the courthouse, loved by her parents and siblings, and known as a reliable presence in the city's legal infrastructure. On February 4th, 1982, during a severe winter blizzard that had locked down St. Louis, she returned to her apartment and did not emerge. Family and colleagues reported her absence after she failed to appear for her shift at the courthouse. Investigators found the evidence of forced entry, a violent sexual assault, and multiple stab wounds. Fluid samples were preserved from the rape kit. Blood typings were taken from bathroom towels used by the killer to clean up before escaping through the snow. Neighbors had seen a man near the apartment building in the period surrounding the crime. Their descriptions were used to generate a composite sketch. It bore no physical resemblance to George Allen, different facial geometry, different structural build, different proportions entirely. Weeks after Mary Bell's murder, a detective spotted Allen wandering the streets of St. Louis miles from her apartment. The detective decided Allen walked like the man in the sketch. That was the evidentiary basis for what followed. Allen was brought, unmedicated and in an acute psychotic state, into an interrogation room. He believed, at various points during the session, that he was somewhere other than a police station. Detectives fed him the details of the crime, which room the body was found in, what weapon was used, in a cycle of on and off recording designed to capture his confirmations while erasing his contradictions. The resulting audio presented a fragmentary, internally inconsistent account from a man who clearly did not know what he was describing. It was the only evidence connecting Allen to Mary Bell's apartment. The hidden blood typing report, the one that proved the true killer had a blood type that excluded Allen, remained in a drawer. Allen was arrested in March 1982 and charged with capital murder, rape, and burglary. He went to trial in 1983 in St. Louis City Circuit Court. The prosecution played the edited confession tape to the jury and did its best to minimize how disoriented Allen sounded on the recording. The defense argued that the confession was manufactured from the fragmentary responses of a psychotic man who had been fed every detail he appeared to know. The defense also pointed out that Allen bore no physical resemblance to the composite sketch. The jury convicted on all counts. In 1983, Allen was sentenced to 95 years in maximum security prison. He served 30 years in Missouri state penitentiaries. Standard post-conviction relief petitions were denied repeatedly across 3 decades. Then, in 2012, attorneys working with the Innocence Project forced the unsealing of the original police laboratory files. Inside those files was the 1982 blood typing report. The document stated plainly that the biological material recovered from Mary Bell's rape kit had been contributed by a donor whose blood type was inconsistent with George Allen's. Police and prosecutors had possessed this result since the year of the crime. They had suppressed it to protect a conviction built on a coerced confession from a man who could not reliably identify the room where the murder occurred. In November 2012, a judge vacated George Allen's conviction on the grounds of egregious prosecutorial suppression of exculpatory evidence. He walked out of prison after 30 years. His case contributed directly to Missouri's mandatory electronic recording requirements for custodial interrogations, specifically targeting the practice of selective recording designed to manufacture coherent statements from vulnerable or mentally ill suspects. George Allen died on October 14, 2020, at the age of 64, under the care of his mother Lily, who had spent 38 years, 30 of them while her son was imprisoned, maintaining his innocence. The blood typing result that proved the killer was someone else existed from 1982. The people who ran the tests understood what it meant. They chose the confession instead, assembled across recording breaks, from a man who believed he was in a hospital, whose physical appearance contradicted the composite entirely, and whose blood type the lab had already cleared. Case 08. Darrell Hunt, August 10th, 1984, 6:30 in the morning. Deborah Sykes, 25 years old, a copy editor at the Sentinel newspaper in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, was walking to work through downtown Forsyth County when she was intercepted, dragged into a vacant lot, sexually assaulted, and stabbed multiple times in the torso. A utility worker found her body in the tall grass later that morning. By the time the case reached trial in 1985, the Ku Klux Klan had held rallies in Winston-Salem demanding the execution of a black suspect. The city's police department produced one. Darrell Hunt, 19 years old, a high school dropout with no violent criminal history who had never met Deborah Sykes and was not in that vacant lot when she died. The state of North Carolina convicted him twice. Hunt was born in Winston-Salem and raised in an impoverished black household where his grandmother and extended family served as his primary support. He worked sporadic manual labor jobs and had accumulated a minor juvenile record containing no violence, no weapons charges, and no history of sexual assault. In a city operating under racial pressure of documented intensity, organized white supremacist groups publicly demanding an arrest, Hunt was exactly the kind of young man the Winston-Salem Police Department needed. Deborah Sykes had built her professional life at the Sentinel, where she worked as a copy editor and had established herself as a respected figure in Forsyth County's journalism community. She was married, 25 years old, a professional who had built her career through consistent, reliable work in the city's legal and media communities, walking to a morning shift she had performed without incident countless times before. Her death produced genuine citywide grief and the kind of political pressure that makes investigators reach for certainty they do not have. The Deborah Sykes Memorial Funds and journalism scholarships established by local newspaper guilds represent the community's legitimate mourning. What the Winston-Salem Police Department did in response to that mourning was less legitimate. Semen samples recovered from Sykes's body via the rape kit were preserved as evidence. Bloodstains marked the grass of the vacant lot. A witness placed a composite sketch near the area around the time of the attack, depicting a suspect with distinct sharp facial traits and specific hair lengths that did not correspond to Darrell Hunt's physical appearance. An acquaintance of Hunt's, seeking both to deflect suspicion from himself and to collect a cash reward, provided Hunt's name to investigators. Detectives accepted it. They purchased corroborating testimonies from street-level informants by dropping pending charges against those individuals. The racial climate of Winston-Salem in 1984, with KKK rallies actively calling for a black suspect's arrest and execution, provided the civic context that made all of this operationally sustainable. Hunt was arrested in August 1984 and charged with first-degree capital murder and first-degree rape. The Forsyth County State Attorney's Office sought the death penalty. The 1985 trial before an overwhelmingly white jury lasted roughly 2 weeks. The prosecution offered purchased informant testimonies and a handled eyewitness photo identification that bypassed the sketch contradictions. Hunt's defense pointed to the total absence of physical evidence linking him to the blood, the semen, or the vacant lot, and presented an alibi placing him away from the downtown corridor. The jury rejected the death penalty but returned a guilty verdict on first-degree murder. Life imprisonment was imposed. The conviction was overturned on a procedural technicality in 1989. North Carolina retried him. At the second trial, Hunt's defense team introduced early DNA testing that produced a result no one on the prosecution's side could explain away. The semen recovered from Deborah Sykes's body did not match Darrell Hunt's DNA. The jury convicted him anyway. The state offered a theory that an unknown accomplice had left the biological material while Hunt performed the stabbing. No accomplice was ever identified. No accomplice was ever charged. The North Carolina courts accepted the theory as legally sufficient, and Hunt returned to prison. He had now served 19 years across 2 wrongful convictions when, in 2003, his legal team finally forced the state to run the crime scene DNA profile through the National CODIS database. The match was immediate and unambiguous. Willard Brown, a violent offender who was already incarcerated in North Carolina for separate local assaults. Law enforcement confronted Brown. He confessed that he alone had attacked, sexually assaulted, and murdered Deborah Sykes on the morning of August 10, 1984, and that Darrell Hunt had played no role whatsoever. In February 2004, Darrell Hunt was officially exonerated and released. The governor of North Carolina granted him a full pardon. His case directly produced the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission, the only state-level governmental body in America established exclusively to investigate credible claims of factual innocence. Hunt died on March 13, 2016, at the age of 51. Between his exoneration and his death, he founded the Darrell Hunt Project for Freedom and Justice and became one of the country's most influential advocates for people navigating release from wrongful imprisonment. He carried the weight of what had been done to him for the rest of his life. The state of North Carolina convicted him the second time after its own DNA test had already proved that the biological evidence at the murder scene did not belong to him. They fabricated an accomplice to save the conviction. He served 19 years for a murder the CODIS database could have resolved in an afternoon.